The first thing Admiral Sarnvehel noticed, in the 11th hour before the humans were due to arrive, was that the silence on his flagship had changed its texture. He had commanded the grand fleet of the Ostrek Dominion for 40 years, and he knew the sound of a fleet the way a physician knows the sound of a body, and the sound he was hearing now was wrong. Not the silence of discipline. Discipline has a sound, a low-taught hum of crews at their stations doing their work without speaking. This was the other silence. The silence of 900,000 beings, across 200 warships, all thinking the same thought at the same time, and none of them daring to say it aloud. He had felt this silence once before, decades ago, as a junior officer, in the hours before a fleet he served on had mutinied. He had hoped never to feel it again. He was feeling it now, and the humans were still 11 hours away, and not a single shot had been fired. 3 decks below him, in the conscript berthing of the same flagship, a young gunner named Tel Oran was trying very hard not to think about his hands. They had started shaking that morning and they had not stopped, and he kept them jammed under his arms so the others would not see. Because among the conscripts there was a thing happening that no one would name, a quiet contagion of the shaking, and to be seen shaking was to spread it. And to spread it was to be the one they blamed when the dread became unbearable. Tel was 19. He had been conscripted 8 months ago from an agricultural moon, and he had never seen a battle, and he was about to see his first against the one enemy whose name was used across the entire Dominion to frighten children into obedience. Be good or the humans will come. He had heard it his whole life. He had never believed it meant anything. He believed it now in his shaking hands, 11 hours out with no shot yet fired. And in the medical bay of that same flagship, the fleet's senior medical officer, a calm, precise being named Dr. Ineth Sorrel, who had patched together the wounded of a dozen campaigns and prided herself on her steadiness, was looking at her casualty intake logs with a growing cold horror because the casualties had already begun and the humans had not arrived, and not a single one of the wounded had a wound. They were coming to her with collapse, with seizure, with hearts that had simply stopped in beings too young for their hearts to stop, with minds that had folded inward and would not come back out. She had treated battle before. She had never treated a battle that had not started yet. And the intake was accelerating, hour by hour, as the human fleet drew closer and did, as far as anyone could tell, absolutely nothing except approach. This is the account of those 11 hours, told through the 3 of them, the admiral, the conscript, and the doctor, because they were the 3 who survived to be asked afterward what it had been like to be aboard a fleet that broke itself before the enemy ever arrived. And because the truth of what happened in those hours is the most important thing the Dominion ever learned about the humans, and the most important thing it never wanted to admit, which is that the humans had defeated the grand fleet of the Ostrek Dominion without firing a shot, using a weapon the Dominion had helped them build, a weapon made of nothing but a name and 40 years of careful, patient reputation, and that by the time the human ships appeared on the screens, the battle was already over. Had been over for hours, had perhaps been over for a generation. Admiral Vehel understood the weapon better than anyone aboard, which was its own kind of curse. He had spent his career studying the humans, the way a man studies the disease he is certain will someday kill him. He knew the history. He knew that the Dominion and the humans had clashed, generations ago, in a war that the Dominion did not like to discuss, a war the Dominion had technically not lost. There had been no surrender, no ceded territory. The borders today were roughly where they had been before, and yet a war that had left something broken in the Dominion that had never healed. Because in that war, the humans had done something to the Ostrek psyche that no weapon could undo. They had become, in the Dominion's collective mind, inevitable. Not strong, the Dominion had faced strong enemies and beaten them. Inevitable. A thing that comes and keeps coming and does not stop, and cannot be reasoned with or frightened or outweighted. A thing that the stories said would walk through fire and through loss and through its own dead to reach you, and would still be coming when everything you had was spent. The humans had earned that reputation in the Old War with deeds Vehel had studied in detail. Deeds of such grinding refusal to break that the Ostrek soldiers who survived them had come home, and without meaning to, taught their children to be afraid, and the children had taught their children, until the fear was no longer a memory of specific deeds, but a thing in the blood, a racial dread passed down, growing, waiting. And the humans had cultivated it. That was the part Vehel found unbearable, now in the 11th hour. He had pieced it together over decades of study, and he was certain of it. The humans knew exactly what they had become in the Ostrek mind, and they had fed it. Every encounter since the Old War, every border skirmish, every diplomatic exchange, the humans had behaved in precisely the way that would deepen the dread. Never threatening, never boasting, always calm, always certain, always carrying themselves like a people who knew, with total serenity, that they would win any fight that came, not because they were strongest, but because they would simply never stop. They had let the Dominion's own fear do their work for them. They had spent 40 years being quietly, calmly terrifying, and they had built, out of the Dominion's own imagination, a weapon more powerful than any fleet. The certainty in every Ostrek heart that to fight the humans was to die, that it had always been to die, that it would always be to die, and that the only question was how much you suffered first. Vehel had studied the Old War the way a scholar studies a sacred text, looking for the specific deeds that had planted the dread, and he knew them all by heart, and in the 11th hour they came to him unbidden, one after another. There was the matter of the Tarman Gap, where a single human cruiser, crippled and venting atmosphere, had refused 6 demands to surrender, and had instead rammed an Ostrek battleship 40 times its size. And the human crew had been heard, in their final transmission, not screaming but singing. And the Ostrek crews who heard that recording had never forgotten it, and had played it for their children as a warning. And the children had been more frightened by the singing than by any threat. Because a thing that sings while it dies is a thing that cannot be made afraid, and a thing that cannot be made afraid cannot be stopped. There was the matter of the Hollow Siege, where the humans had been surrounded, cut off, starved, certain to fall, and had held for 200 days, and had walked out at the end still in formation. And the Ostrek records of that siege did not even describe a defeat. They described, in the baffled language of the officers who witnessed it, a thing that would not end. And that phrase had entered the Ostrek language and stayed there. A thing that would not end. A phrase used now to mean the humans, used to frighten. Used to explain why the war could never truly be won. And there was the matter, the worst matter, the one Vehel could not think about even now without something cold moving through him, of the human admiral at the Battle of the Three Moons, who had lost his entire fleet, every ship, every crew, and who had then, alone in a single escape craft, transmitted to the victorious Ostrek commander not a plea and not a curse but a promise, a calm and specific promise, that humanity would remember, that humanity always remembered. That the Ostrek had won the battle and would spend the next 100 years learning that winning a battle against humanity was the most dangerous thing a people could do. And humanity had kept that promise, not with fleets, but with exactly this. With the slow cultivation of a dread so total that 100 years later it could break a grand fleet without a shot. The human admiral at the Three Moons had lost everything, and had still, somehow, won, because he had understood the weapon that Vehel only now fully understood. That you do not need to defeat a people if you can make them defeat themselves, and that the way you make a people defeat themselves is to become, in their imagination, a thing that would not end. So when the diplomatic situation had finally collapsed, Vehel did not even fully understand how. Some dispute over a border system, some failure of negotiation that the politicians had handled with their usual blend of pride and stupidity. And the Dominion had been forced to send the Grand Fleet to meet an approaching human fleet. The Grand Fleet had sailed out carrying, in addition to its weapons and its crews, 200 shiploads of inherited terror. And the terror had begun, immediately, to do what terror does. It had begun to eat the fleet from the inside. Tel Oran felt it eating him in the berthing decks, and he did not have the admiral's understanding to name it, but he felt its shape. It had started, he thought, with the briefings. The officers had tried to prepare them, and the preparation had made it worse, because the officers themselves were afraid, and a frightened officer cannot hide it from frightened conscripts, and so each briefing had been a transmission of dread from those who should have been steady to those who looked to them for steadiness. The officers had shown them the humans' record. They had meant, Tel thought, to make the conscripts angry, to give them an enemy to hate. Instead, they had shown 200 shiploads of 19-year-olds exactly why their grandparents had been afraid, and the conscripts had absorbed it, and the dread had found the soil it had been bred in over generations, and it had grown. By the 8th hour, the conscript decks had stopped being a fighting force and had started being something else, something Tel did not have a word for but lived inside of, a held breath, a crowd at the edge of a panic, a structure under a load it was not built to bear. The shaking had spread. The not sleeping had spread. And worse things had spread, the rumors, the certainties, the quiet shared knowledge that passed between conscripts in looks and half-sentences, the knowledge that they were already dead, that the fleet was already lost, that the humans were not really 11 hours away but were somehow already here, already among them, already inside the dread itself. Tel had heard a conscript 2 bunks down whispering in the dark of the 8th hour that the humans did not need to arrive, that the humans had already won, that the only thing left was the dying, and that the smart ones would do it themselves before the humans could do it to them. Tel had wanted to tell him to stop. He had not been able to make his mouth work. His hands were shaking too hard. Tel kept returning in those hours to a memory he had not thought about in years, and the memory frightened him more the more he understood it. When he was small on the agricultural moon, there had been an old veteran of the last war who lived at the edge of his settlement, a being everyone called the Quiet One, who never spoke of what he had seen and who flinched at sudden lights and who, the other children said, had fought the humans and come back wrong. Tel had been afraid of the Quiet One as a child, the way children are afraid of the broken, without understanding. And now, in the 8th hour, jammed into a berthing deck that was coming apart around him, Tel understood the Quiet One at last, understood with a horror that doubled his own, because he understood that the Quiet One had not come back wrong from the fighting. The Quiet One had come back wrong from the fear, had carried, for the rest of his life, the thing that Tel was carrying now, the unbearable dread of an enemy that would not end, and had never been able to set it down, and had lived out his years flinching at lights on a quiet moon, a casualty of a weapon that left no mark on the body. Tel understood in the 8th hour that even the ones who survived the humans did not survive the humans, that the fear followed them home and lived in their settlements at the edges of things, and frightened the children into carrying it forward, and that this was the design, this was the whole design, that the humans had built a weapon that wounded across generations, that turned every survivor into a transmitter, that used the love of grandparents for grandchildren as the very mechanism of its spread. Be good or the humans will come. The Quiet One's fear, poured into a child, poured into Tel, poured now into the shaking of his own hands in the 8th hour. The weapon had been aimed at him before he was born, by people who loved him, who thought they were protecting him, who were only passing forward the wound that had been passed to them. He held his shaking hands under his arms and he thought about the Quiet One, and he made himself a promise that he did not believe he would live to keep, that if he survived, if, somehow, against everything he survived, he would not be the Quiet One. He would not carry the fear home. He would not pour it into a child. He did not know yet how he would keep that promise. He did not know that an old admiral 3 decks above him was about to show him how. Dr. Sorrell received that conscript in the medical bay in the 9th hour. He had not waited for the humans. He had done the thing the whispering predicted, the thing she was now seeing more and more of, the thing that no medical text in her training had prepared her to treat because no medical text had ever conceived of a battle that killed its soldiers before it began. She saved him, barely, and she logged him, and she looked at her accelerating intake, and she understood with her precise clinical mind that she was witnessing something that was not a medical phenomenon at all but a strategic one. The humans had built a weapon that killed without firing, and she was its emergency room, and there was nothing in her bay that could treat the wound, because the wound was not in the body. The wound was a thought. The thought was, they are coming and they will not stop and we cannot win. And that thought, planted generations ago and cultivated ever since, was now metastasizing through 900,000 minds at once, and it was killing them. And she could suture a body, but she could not suture a fleet's belief that it was already dead. She had begun, by the 9th hour, to keep 2 sets of records, and the second set was the one that frightened her. The first set was the clinical intake, the seizures, the cardiac events, the dissociative collapses, all logged in the precise language of her profession. The second set she kept for herself in the margins, and it was a record not of symptoms but of words, the things her patients said as they came apart, because she had noticed with her careful mind that they were all saying versions of the same things, that the dread was not random but structured, that it had a grammar, that 900,000 minds breaking independently were all breaking along the same lines, speaking the same phrases, as though they had all been infected by the same text. It will not end. It will not stop. We are already dead. There is no point. They are already here. Over and over, from beings who had never met, who came from different worlds and different ships and different lives, the same phrases, the same grammar of doom. And Dr. Sorrell understood, writing them down, that she was documenting the actual structure of the weapon, that the humans had, across 100 years, installed a kind of script in the Ostrek mind, a script that activated under the pressure of their approach, and that every breaking conscript was reciting that script as they broke, the same way a struck bell rings at the same note no matter who strikes it. She was, she realized, the first being ever to see the weapon clearly, to document its mechanism, to understand that it was not vague dread but a specific cultivated structure with a specific grammar, and the understanding terrified her more than the casualties did, because it meant the weapon was real, was engineered, was precise, and had been aimed at her people with a patience that spanned generations. She went to the admiral in the 9th hour. She had the standing to do it. A senior medical officer can demand audience with a commander when the fleet's fitness is at stake. She found Vehel alone on a small observation deck, looking out at the dark where the humans would appear, and she told him plainly, in numbers, what was happening to his fleet. She told him the casualty rate. She told him the projection, that at the current rate of psychological collapse, a significant fraction of the fleet's crews would be combat ineffective before the humans even arrived, not from any action of the enemy, but from the simple, unbearable weight of waiting for them. She told him that she had in her medical bay soldiers who had died of fear, actually died, hearts stopped, and that she expected more, and that there was nothing she could do, because the disease was not in her patients but in the air the whole fleet breathed. And Admiral Vehel, who had known all of this already, who had felt it coming for 40 years, did a thing that surprised the doctor. He did not dismiss her. He did not order her to keep it quiet, to maintain morale, to do the things commanders do to deny a collapse. He turned from the dark and he looked at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, an expression of a being who had finally arrived at a truth he had spent his career trying to outrun, and he said, "I know. I have always known. We were beaten before we left port. We were beaten before any of these children were born. The humans did not bring an army to this border, doctor. They did not need to. They sent the army we built for them, in our own minds, generation by generation, and it is doing exactly what they designed it to do. And there is not one thing I can do to stop it, because you cannot order a fleet to stop being afraid of the thing it has been raised since birth to fear." The doctor showed him her second set of records then, the grammar of the dread, the script she had documented, the same phrases from 100 breaking minds. And Vehel read them, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said something that she did not expect, something that revealed how completely he had understood the weapon, how long he had carried the understanding alone. He said, "You have found it. You have found the actual shape of it. Do you know what this is, Doctor? This is the thing I have been trying to make the Dominion see for 40 years, and they would not, because to see it is to admit that we did it to ourselves. The humans did not put these words in our children's minds. We did. The humans only made themselves frightening. We did the rest. We took their frightfulness and we built it into a teaching, a saying, a thing we passed to our young with their mother's milk, and every generation we made it a little more complete, a little more precise, until it became this, a script, as you say, a grammar of doom, installed in every Ostrek mind before it is old enough to resist. The humans built the bomb. But we have spent 100 years carrying it into our own nurseries and arming it against our own children. The weapon is half theirs and half ours, and the half that is ours is the half that makes it work, because a fear that comes only from the enemy can be doubted, but a fear that comes from your own grandmother, who loved you, who only wanted to keep you safe, that fear cannot be doubted, because doubting it means doubting her love. And so it goes down into the deepest place and it stays there, and 100 years later it breaks a grand fleet without a shot. The doctor asked him, because she was precise, and because she needed to understand whether there was truly nothing to be done, whether the fleet was simply to dissolve, here, in the dark, killing itself with dread until the humans arrived to find a wreck that had defeated itself. And Vehel was quiet for a long moment, and then he said the thing that became, afterward, the center of everything, the decision that changed what those 11 hours meant. He said, "There is one thing. It will not save the fleet. The fleet is already lost. The fear has it, and the fear will finish it whether the humans fire a shot or not. But there is one thing I can still do, and it is the only command I have left that means anything." And he explained it to her, slowly, the way a being explains a thing they have only just understood themselves. He said that for his whole career, he had believed there were two responses available to a fleet facing the humans, fight or surrender, and that both responses fed the weapon. To fight was to confirm the fear, to die screaming as prey, exactly as the dread predicted, proving the script true with your last breath. To surrender was worse, to confirm the fear and add shame to it, to become the cowering thing the weapon was designed to produce. For 40 years he had believed those were the only two options, and both were defeats, and that was why he had carried the certainty of doom, because every path led through the weapon, and the weapon won on every path. But there was a third path, he told her, and he had only seen it in the 9th hour, looking into the dark with her casualty figures in his hand. The third path was neither fight nor surrender. It was refusal, not refusal to fight the humans, but refusal to be afraid, refusal to be the thing the weapon was built to make. He told her that the weapon's entire power was that it made the Ostrek meet the humans as frightened things, and that if the fleet could meet the humans, just once, as unafraid things, not unafraid because there was nothing to fear but unafraid because they had chosen together to set the fear down, then the weapon would have failed, even if the fleet died, even if the humans destroyed them, because the weapon was not built to kill Ostrek bodies. It was built to kill Ostrek dignity, to make a proud people meet their enemy as cowering prey. And a fleet that set down its fear and met the humans still and unafraid would deny the weapon its actual purpose, would die, if it died, as something the weapon was specifically designed to prevent, which was a people who were brave in the only way that counted. "I cannot give them victory," Vehel said. "I cannot give them survival, but I can give them the one thing the weapon was built to steal, which is the right to meet their end unafraid. And if I am going to lose this fleet, and I am, Doctor, I have known it for 40 years, then I am going to lose it as the thing it chose to be, and not as the thing 100 years of fear made it. That is the only command I have left. And I am going to give it." And the doctor went cold, and then she understood, and then, for the first time in those 11 hours, She felt something other than horror. She felt the strange, terrible relief of a being watching another being choose, at the very end, to be the thing they should have been all along. But I am getting ahead of the hours. Let me return to the conscript decks, to tell Iran in the 10th hour, because what happened to the conscripts in the 10th hour is the thing that proves the admiral right, the thing that shows exactly how complete the human's weapon was. In the 10th hour the human fleet became visible, not arrived visible. At the extreme edge of the long-range sensors, the human ships appeared, still an hour out, still far beyond any weapon's reach, doing nothing but approaching at a steady, unhurried pace. And the appearance of them on the screens did to the conscript decks what the admiral had feared and the doctor had predicted. It broke the last of the structure. Because for 10 hours the humans had been an idea, a dread, a thing in the imagination, and an idea you can, with effort, hold at bay. But now they were real, they were there. They were points of light on a screen growing slowly larger, and the dread that had been abstract became concrete, and the concrete dread was more than the conscript decks could hold. Tell watched it happen around him, and he watched it happen inside him, and he was helpless against both. He watched a fleet, no, he watched a family, because that is what a crew becomes, 8 months together in a steel box. They become a kind of family. He watched his family come apart. Some of them wept. Some of them went still in a way that was worse than weeping, a way that meant they had left, that the body was still there, but the person had gone somewhere the dread could not follow, somewhere they might not come back from. Some of them prayed to the old moon gods of the agricultural worlds, gods Tell had thought no one believed in anymore, gods whose names came pouring out now in the 10th hour because there was nothing else left to reach for. And some of them, this was the worst, this was the thing Tell would carry, some of them turned on each other, because terror that cannot reach its true object will find a nearer one, and conscripts who had been brothers an hour before were suddenly screaming at each other, blaming each other, and in one berthing compartment it went further than screaming, and the officers had to seal the compartment, and Tell did not know what happened inside it and did not want to know. He held his shaking hands under his arms, and he did the only thing he could think to do, which was to remember the agricultural moon, the smell of the soil after the rains, his mother's hands, which were large and calloused and gentle, sorting seed in the long evenings, the particular gold of the light over the fields at the close of day. He held those things against the dread the way you hold a door against a flood, and he knew the door would not hold, and he held it anyway, because holding it was the only dignity he had left, and a 19-year-old conscript who has nothing left will hold a door against a flood simply to prove to himself that he was, for one more minute, still a person and not just a vessel for fear. And then, in the 11th hour, with the human ships an hour become half an hour become minutes, the admiral did the thing he had told the doctor he would do. He addressed the fleet, all of it. Every ship, every deck, every conscript on every channel at once, and Tell, in the berthing, heard the admiral's voice come over the speakers, and the whole compartment went still, because a fleet about to die will go still for the voice of the one who commands its dying. And the admiral did not give them courage. That is the thing Tell remembered most afterward, the thing that made him weep when he understood it. The admiral did not lie to them. He did not tell them they would win, or that the humans could be beaten, or that the fear was unfounded. He had too much respect for them at the end to lie. Instead, the admiral told them the truth, the whole truth, the truth he had carried alone for 40 years, and the truth was this. Children of the Dominion, I am going to tell you what is happening to you because you deserve to die knowing it and not in confusion. You are afraid. You have been afraid since before you were born. The fear you feel is not yours. It was given to you, bred into you, passed down from grandparents who met the humans long ago and were broken by them, not in body but in spirit, and who taught their children to fear, who taught you. The humans know this. They have spent your whole lives and your parents' whole lives making the fear deeper on purpose, because a fear deep enough is a weapon that wins wars without firing. That is what is killing you now. Not the humans. the fear of the humans. You are dying of a weapon made of dread, and the dread was made from you, from your own minds, harvested across generations. I tell you this so that you understand. You are not cowards. There are no cowards on this fleet. You are the bravest beings I have ever commanded, because you are still at your stations, still holding, while carrying a terror that was engineered across 100 years to be unbearable. That you have not all broken is the greatest feat of courage I have witnessed in 40 years of war. And this was the thing, this was the command that mattered, the admiral said. I am not going to ask you to fight. Listen to me. I am not going to ask you to fight the humans because we cannot win, and I will not spend your lives on a thing we cannot win, and I will not let your last act be a death in a battle that the fear has already lost for us. Instead, I am going to ask you to do the hardest thing, the bravest thing, the thing the fear most wants to prevent. I am going to ask you to stop, to stand down, to power down your weapons, every ship all at once, and to let the humans find us not as a fleet that died screaming of its own dread, but as a fleet that looked at the most frightening thing in the galaxy, and refused at the very end with its last strength to be made into a thing that dies afraid. We cannot beat them. But we can refuse to be what they made us. We can stand down. We can be still. We can meet them not as prey and not as cowards, but as beings who, in the last hour, took back the one thing the fear had stolen, which is the right to choose how we meet our end. Power down your weapons, all of you. That is my last order. Be unafraid, not because there is nothing to fear, but because we choose together in the face of everything to set the fear down. Set it down. Set it down, my children. We have carried it long enough. And the fleet set it down. Tell Iran, in the berthing deck, felt it happen, not just heard it but felt it, the way you feel a fever break. He took his shaking hands out from under his arms, and he looked at them, and they were still shaking. But it did not matter any more that they were shaking, because the admiral had told him the shaking was not cowardice. The shaking was 100 years of inherited dread finally being set down, and a thing you are setting down is allowed to shake on the way out of you. Around him, the compartment changed. The weeping did not stop, but it changed. It became a different kind of weeping, the kind that comes not from terror but from release, from the unbearable relief of being told the truth after 10 hours of being lied to by your own fear. The ones who had gone still came back, some of them, drawn back by the admiral's voice, by the permission to be afraid and to stand down anyway. The ones who had turned on each other turned back, and held each other, because that is the other thing terror's nearer object can become when the true object is set down, not a target but a brother again. The conscript decks of the flagship, which had been a held breath about to become a scream, became instead something the Dominion had no word for. A fleet exhaling all at once, 100 years of fear, and choosing in the exhale to be still. And across 200 ships, the weapons powered down. One by one and then all at once, the grand fleet of the Ostrek Dominion lowered its guns, not in surrender. There was no surrender signal. The admiral sent no white flag, but in something stranger and more dignified, a deliberate setting down. A fleet disarming itself not because it was beaten, but because it refused to die as the frightened thing it had been bred to be. Dr. Sorrell watched it on the medical bay monitors, watched the fleet-wide weapon signatures fade to nothing, and she watched her casualty intake stop, in the 11th hour, for the first time since the humans appeared, because the thing that had been killing her patients was the dread, and the admiral had just given the entire fleet permission to set the dread down, and a fleet that has set down its dread stops dying of it. She had spent the 11 hours unable to treat the wound. The admiral had treated it with a single command, the only command that could have worked. Not fight, which would have fed the fear, and not surrender, which would have confirmed it, but set it down and be still, and choose your own ending. She wept at her station. She was not ashamed of it. She had earned it. And then the human fleet arrived. This is the part that no one in the Dominion believed afterward, the part that Tell and the doctor and the admiral all told the same way and were all disbelieved, because it did not fit anything the Dominion knew about the humans, because it broke the weapon the humans had spent 100 years building, because it was the last thing a people raised to fear the humans could imagine the humans doing. The humans arrived, and they found the grand fleet of the Ostrek Dominion sitting silent and disarmed in the dark, weapons cold, 200 ships making no move to fight and no move to flee and no move to surrender, simply being still, the way the admiral had asked. And the human fleet, which could have in that moment destroyed the disarmed Ostrek fleet utterly, which had every tactical reason to, which had come for a battle and found its enemy helpless before it, the human fleet stopped. It stopped and it held its fire, and after a long moment the humans hailed the Ostrek flagship. And the voice that came across, Tell heard it relayed through the ship, the doctor heard it in the medical bay, the admiral heard it on the bridge. The voice was not triumphant, and it was not threatening, and it was, of all the things it could have been, gentle. A human voice, tired and gentle, and it said, Ostrek fleet, this is the human fleet. We see that you've stood down. We see your weapons are cold. We want you to know that we see what you did. We've been watching your fleet for the last 10 hours, and we know what was happening over there, and we know what it cost you to set it down. And we want you to know that we are not going to fire on a fleet that chose to be still. We came here because our politicians failed and yours did, and we were ready to do the terrible thing, and we are so relieved, you cannot know how relieved, that we don't have to. Because here is the truth your admiral is too gracious to tell you, and that we are ashamed enough to tell you ourselves. We have spent 100 years making you afraid of us. We know we did it. We are not proud of it. It is a coward's weapon, fear, however well it works, and we have leaned on it because it let us win wars without filling space with the dead, and we told ourselves that was mercy. But it is not mercy to make a whole people afraid for 100 years. It is only a different kind of cruelty, a quieter one. We watched your children dying of the fear we built over there for 10 hours before we ever came in range, and it shamed us, all of us, every soul on this fleet. So we are going to do the thing that the fear says we will never do. We are going to stop. We are going to lower our weapons too. And we are going to ask you not as your conquerors, because we will not be your conquerors today, to talk to us. Just talk. Because two fleets that both chose in the same hour to set down their weapons rather than become the thing the war wanted them to be. Those are two peoples who might, if they are brave enough, find that they were never as different as 100 years of fear has told them. And the human fleet lowered its weapons. Tel Iran did not understand in that moment the full size of what was happening. He was 19, and he had spent 10 hours dying of inherited dread, and he was not capable, yet, of grasping that he was witnessing the end of a 100-year war that had killed his fleet without a shot, and was now, impossibly, not going to kill it at all. He understood only the immediate thing, the bodily thing, that the humans, the inevitable humans, the humans his grandmother had used to frighten him into eating his food, had arrived to find his fleet helpless, and had not killed him. He took his hands out from under his arms again. They had stopped shaking. He looked at them in wonder, a 19-year-old looking at his own steady hands, and he began quietly to laugh, not from joy exactly, but from the impossible lightness of a being who had spent his whole life carrying a fear, and had set it down in the 11th hour at the command of a dying admiral, and had then watched the very thing he feared arrive and prove, with its own lowered weapons, that the fear had been a thing built and not a thing true, a 100-year-old lie that two fleets had just agreed together to stop telling. Dr. Sorrel in the medical bay did a thing she had not done in 20 years of service. She left her post. She walked out of the medical bay, through the corridors of a flagship that was supposed to be a battlefield and was instead full of weeping, embracing, disbelieving crews, and she went to a viewport, and she looked out at the human fleet, the thing she had been raised to fear above all else, and she saw it lowering its weapons, and she understood with her precise clinical mind that she had been wrong about what she was witnessing, all 11 hours. She had thought she was witnessing a fleet die of fear. She had been witnessing, instead, the death of the fear itself. The moment a 100-year-old weapon made of dread was set down by both the hand that wielded it and the hand it was wielded against in the same hour, by mutual exhausted choice. The wound she could not suture had healed itself, not through medicine, but through the one thing more powerful than fear, which is two frightened peoples each deciding at the same moment to stop. And Admiral Vehel, on the bridge, the only one aboard who had understood the weapon from the beginning, wept openly in front of his officers, and was not ashamed, because he had carried the certainty of his fleet's death for 40 years, and had just watched that certainty dissolve into something he had never once allowed himself to hope for. He had given the order to set down the fear, expecting it to be a dignified death, a fleet choosing how to die rather than dying as prey. He had not expected it to be a door. He had not expected that the act of setting down the fear, witnessed by the humans who had built it, would shame the humans into setting it down too. He had thought he was choosing the manner of his fleet's ending. He had instead, without knowing it, chosen the manner of a 100-year war's ending. Because the humans, watching an enemy refuse to die afraid, had discovered that they could no longer bear to be the thing that made others afraid, and had set down the weapon that had defined them. And in the setting down, both peoples had become, in a single hour, something neither had been in 100 years, unafraid of each other. They talked. That is how it ended, and it is the strangest ending of any war in the history of either people, and it is true. The two fleets which had come to destroy each other instead lowered their weapons and talked, first the admirals, then the officers, then, eventually in the days that followed, the crews, the conscripts, the doctors, the ordinary beings on both sides who had been raised to fear each other and who discovered, talking, that they had both been carrying the same exhaustion, the same dread of a war neither had truly wanted, the same secret wish that someone, anyone, would be brave enough to set the weapon down first. And the humans, when they talked, told the Ostrek things that the Ostrek had never imagined, things that unmade the last of the fear by revealing the truth behind it. The human admiral, a tired old being named Commander Hale, who reminded Vehel achingly of himself, told Vehel in their first long conversation that the humans had been afraid too. That was the thing the Ostrek could not at first believe, the thing that broke the weapon completely. The humans had been afraid of the Ostrek the entire time. Hale explained it without shame, because he had decided, watching the Ostrek fleet set down its fear, that shame was a thing both peoples had carried long enough. He said that the humans had built the weapon of dread not out of strength, but out of terror. That after the old war, the humans had been so frightened of the Ostrek Dominion, so certain they could not win a real war against its size and its industry, that they had reached for the only weapon a frightened people could afford, which was reputation, which was fear, which was the slow cultivation of a dread that would let them win without fighting, because they did not believe they could win by fighting. The humans had not made the Ostrek afraid, because the humans were fearless conquerors. The humans had made the Ostrek afraid because the humans were also afraid, and had found a way to make their fear contagious, to give it to the enemy so completely that the enemy's fear became larger than their own. The whole 100-year weapon, Hale confessed, had been built by frightened people who were too afraid to admit they were frightened, and who had spent a century making sure their enemy was more afraid than they were, because as long as the enemy was more afraid, the humans could pretend they were not afraid at all. Vehel wept again, hearing that, because it was the final piece, the thing that dissolved the last of the dread he had carried for 40 years. The humans were not inevitable. The humans were not a thing that would not end. The humans were a frightened people, exactly like the Ostrek, who had been so afraid of a war they did not think they could win that they had built a weapon of pure fear and aimed it across the dark. And the Ostrek had received it, and amplified it, and turned it on their own children. And for 100 years 2 terrified peoples had each believed the other was fearless, had each built their whole understanding of the other on a dread that was, on both sides, a mask for the same simple terror. They had been mirror images the entire time. 2 frightened peoples, Each convinced the other was the thing to fear, each making the other more afraid, in a spiral 100 years deep, until an old admiral and a tired commander in the same hour, each set down the fear and discovered across the dark that there had never been anything on the other side but another frightened being who wanted, as much as they did, for the fear to finally end. That was the thing the talks revealed day after day, in conversation after conversation between beings who had been raised to fear each other. That the fear had been mutual, that it had been a mask on both faces, that the war had been, the entire time, two terrified peoples each running from a reflection. And once that was seen, once it could not be unseen, the war was not merely over. It was revealed to have never truly existed, to have been a shared nightmare from which both peoples were now, in the 11th hour and the days after, finally waking. The Ostrek had feared the humans had feared the Ostrek, and the fear had been the only enemy either people ever had. Tel Iran went home, eventually, to the agricultural moon. He sorted seed in the long evenings beside his mother, whose hands he had held in his mind through the worst hour of his life, and when his own children came, years later, he did not tell them to be good or the humans would come. He told them instead about the 11th hour, about the admiral who told the truth, about the fear that was set down, about the day two fleets chose to be still. He told them that the humans were not monsters and had never been monsters, that they had been frightened people who built a frightening weapon, and then, in the end, were brave enough and ashamed enough to set it down. He told them that the bravest thing he had ever seen was not a battle but its refusal. And he held up his hands, which were steady now, which had been steady ever since the 11th hour, and he told his children that fear is a thing that can be set down, that it is heavier than anything, and that setting it down is the hardest and the bravest act there is, and that he had learned this not from a victory but from a fleet that broke itself with dread, and then, in its last hour, chose to stop being broken, and was answered across the dark by an enemy brave enough to stop too. Dr. Sorrell wrote a paper afterward. It was a medical paper, precise and clinical, documenting the casualties of those 11 hours, the seizures, the stopped hearts, the minds that folded inward, all of it, the full toll of a battle fought entirely with fear before a shot was fired. It became, in time, the most important medical document in the history of the Dominion, because it proved with numbers the thing the admiral had told the fleet, that the fear was a weapon, that it killed, that it had been built and cultivated and aimed, and that it could be set down. The paper changed how the Dominion raised its children. It ended the old saying, "Be good, or the humans will come." That sentence, which had frightened 100 years of children, was unmade by a doctor's careful documentation of what such sentences cost, totaled across generations, in stopped hearts and folded minds. The Dominion learned, from Dr. Sorrell's numbers, that the most dangerous thing you can do to your own children is teach them to be afraid, because the fear becomes a weapon that your enemies can aim back at you, and the only defense against it is the hardest thing of all, which is to refuse to teach the fear in the first place. And Admiral Veho, old Admiral Veho, who had carried the certainty of doom for 40 years and had set it down in the 11th hour, Admiral Veho lived to see the peace, and helped to build it, and spent his last years doing the thing he had never imagined he would do, which was to meet the humans not as an enemy but as a friend, to sit across tables from the beings he had feared his whole life, and to discover, again and again, that they were tired and gentle and ashamed and brave. Much like himself, much like his conscripts, much like everyone, on both sides, who had spent 100 years afraid of a war that neither people had ever really wanted. He said, near the end of his life, that the 11th hour had been the proudest of his career, prouder than any victory, because in it he had done the only thing a commander can truly do that matters, which is not to win a battle, but to give his people permission to be brave in the one way that actually counts, the bravery of setting down the fear, of refusing to become the frightened thing the war wanted them to be, of meeting the most terrible thing in the galaxy and choosing together to be still. Before the first shot fired, the enemy was already breaking. That part is true. The grand fleet of the Ostrek Dominion was breaking itself, hour by hour, with a dread 100 years in the making, and by the 11th hour it was nearly gone, a fleet dying of its own fear before the enemy ever arrived. And then the human fleet arrived. That part is true too. But everything the title promises and everything the fear predicted, the arrival of the humans was supposed to mean the end, the slaughter, the inevitable doom finally made real. Instead, the humans arrived and found a fleet that had set down its fear, and they were so moved by it, and so ashamed of the weapon they had built, that they set down their own, and the war ended in the only way a war built entirely of fear could ever truly end, with both sides in the same hour choosing to stop being afraid. The fleet broke itself, and then in breaking it broke the thing that had been breaking it, the 100-year weapon, the inherited dread, the lie that the humans were inevitable and that to meet them was to die. The admiral set it down. The humans answered. And two peoples who had been at war in their imaginations for a century looked at each other across the dark, lowered their weapons, and discovered that the war had only ever been the fear, and that the fear could be set down, and that on the other side of the fear there was no enemy at all, only another tired people, who had been just as afraid for just as long, and who were just as relieved in the 11th hour to finally set it down.